I will introduce our next speaker, Ofelia Ferran. Ofelia is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies in the University of Minnesota. She specializes in contemporary Spanish literature and culture. She is the author of Working Through Memory, Writing and Remembrance in Contemporary Spanish Narrative and co-editor of Legacies of Violence in Contemporary Spain, Exhuming the Past, Understanding the Present, a critical companion to Jorge Semprún, and others. So she has also published issues related to historical memory of the Spanish Civil War and Franco dictatorship. Her presentation is titled Francesc Torres, The Performance of Trauma. So please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you, Magali. So I'm going to talk today about an art piece with the artist present, which I don't know if that's going to make my work easy or hard. I'm hoping it'll make it easy, because if I get any questions at the end, I'm just going to say, ask him. Go direct to the source. It might be hard because if I look up while I'm talking and you have like a strange look on your face, then I'm going to be very worried. But anyway, here we go. Events during the last year have made it clear once again, as has happened repeatedly since the death of General Francisco Franco in 1975, how difficult it is for Spain to confront the trauma and legacies of the violence of its recent past. On the 20th of November of last year, the anniversary of Franco's death, and we've seen some of these images that I'm going to show you now in previous presentations. Major demonstrations took place in Spain in honor of the dictator's memory, some in the front of the dictator's mausoleum, the monumental Valle de los Caídos, as we've seen. We've seen a lot of that in the morning. Although such pro-Franco manifestations have taken place regularly since his death, they have been explicitly made illegal since 2007 by the so-called Law of Historical Memory. Yet last year they had an added urgency, given the fact that the socialist government in Spain had decided that they were going to call for the exhumation. And we've seen in-depth description of that process this morning. I just wanted to show that events happening in Spain are not just related to Spain. The legacy of Francoism is long in Spain, just like that 450-foot tall stone cross atop the Valle de los Caídos. The devotion that many in Spain still feel for the dictator is part of that legacy. So is the lack of understanding on the part of large sectors of Spanish society of the magnitude of the repression imposed by Franco on Spain, especially in the immediate post-war era, but all the way up to his death. We cannot forget that the last 5 executions of political prisoners happened just 2 months before the dictator's death. A few details are illuminating with respect to this long shadow of Franco. In 2008, a national poll asking people about their impression of the regime, 1/3 of Spaniards responded that they had an overall positive evaluation of it, claiming it had maintained peace, order, and national unity. In fact, the very rhetoric of the regime. Last summer, in a television interview, a Spanish lieutenant general in reserve complained of what he saw as an effort to tarnish the image of the dictator with what was happening. For Franco, he said, without a hint of irony, on television, killed no one. So you see that alternative facts are not just alive and well here in the US. Today I would like to look back and examine a performance piece from 1975 by Francesc Torres. We saw some of his images for his last piece, but now I'm going to go back to an early performance piece, whose long artistic trajectory presents a continued meditation on memory and power that critically engages with discourses and their legacies that lead to social, political, economic violence in the form not only of human rights abuses, but also of a less obvious structural violence that permeates society in times of supposed peace. And he said that himself. His work has been greatly influenced by his own intergenerational trauma of belonging to a family that fought for the losing side of the Spanish Civil War and suffered the repression imposed on the war's losers by Franco, through the imprisonment of his grandfather. And again, he said that in the morning, the most defining event of his whole life happened 9 years before he was born. I want to explore here how the critical exploration of his personal history and of his traumatic post-memorial condition served Torres as a springboard for a broader reflection on the interrelationship between trauma and history, both on the personal and collective level. Torres has had a markedly nomadic life, living in Barcelona, moving to Paris, then to the United States, where he lived for many years, and now going back and forth. In the 60s and 70s, despite living abroad for extended periods of time, he was an integral part of a collective of artists in his native Catalunya, the Grup de Treball, with whom he continued to collaborate until, for various reasons, the members of the group went their different ways. The group is a collective and acted in innovative artistic interventions characterized by both the radical questioning of the traditional forms and institutional settings of the art world, typical of the conceptual art of the time, and an explicitly political praxis, openly critical of Franco and supportive of the wider political struggle against the regime. I'm going to give you an example of one of the interventions they did. I don't think Francesc actually worked on this particular project, but I just think it's kind of an interesting one, where the Grup de Treball created this ballot asking these questions about people's conceptions of art, and I believe they had it in the street. I'm not sure, maybe you can tell us later. But this was in 1971, asking, should art be active or passive? Do you believe in the aesthetic development of the senses? Should art be in the street? And are you living an art event right now? So clearly the political dimensions of having a ballot at that time was not lost on anyone, but also the idea that art can go beyond the traditional art setting is important. This dual critical practice, which deconstructs traditional notions of art and the institutional context of the art world, as much as it does the political context of Francoism, can be seen in the project that I will explore here, a performance called Almost Like Sleeping, performed in New York City in 1975. In the performance, Torres slept in a cot in the middle of the gallery, flanked on either side above his head by large projected images of Franco and Torres's maternal left wing and highly authoritarian grandfather on the other, as two figures who had greatly conditioned his life, and each image has a label of cultural conditioner on it. Torres has explained the presence of his grandfather in this piece, and I quote, "He was a militant member of Esquerra Republicana, although he started off being an anarchist when he was still an adolescent. He began working to make a living at 9 years old, and he was in jail after the war, first condemned to death, then to a life sentence. The term cultural conditioner wanted to show that his influence went far beyond the purely ideological and included questions of identity, sexuality, virility, and many other things that had a great impact in my childhood and adolescent development." On the wall to the side of the cot where Torres slept, slide projections flashed phrases he had heard during his childhood and youth that had deeply affected him in different ways. There are phrases, for example, that embody a staunchly patriarchal view, one that could have come down from either one of the two cultural conditioners present, despite their political differences. For example, if you don't climb the tree, you're a girl and a chicken. When I was 13, I was fighting with the police on the street, and all you do is play with girls. Other sentences show a narrow and highly problematic understanding of Marxist politics, one with which the artist struggled while affiliated to the Communist Party in Spain for a time. Others portray the stifling, suffocating religious moral code so central to the Franco regime. As Kathy Carruth explains, to be traumatized is to be possessed by an image or event. And that possession is made evident by the fact that the exact time and place where the phrases were heard is noted, indicating the traumatic impact these phrases had on the artist, who still remembers them so vividly that he can pinpoint exactly when he heard them so many years later. A film loop was projected above the artist's head, showing Torres biting his nails. With an extreme close-up of his hands, with the nails bitten down to the bone, the manifestation of a symptom through which the repressive force of the social, political, ideological, and gender conditioning of his upbringing, embodied in all the other elements of the piece, was made manifest. Torres has described his nail biting as the most visually accessible characteristic of my psyche. It is thus a symptom of history itself, which continues to scar his body in the present, just as it has entered the most private spaces of his being, a symptom that breaks down distinctions between past and present, inside and outside. The visual material of the performance was accompanied by 2 audio tapes, which ran in approximately 12-minute cycles for 2 hours, spoken in the third person. The 2 tapes told the same story until midpoint, Torres' experience as a young child. At midpoint, however, the tapes diverged. In the first, the boy chose a career in the visual arts. In the second, a life in theater, a small but significant difference. Both tapes ended by stating that the boy made this decision thinking he had made a free choice. Shelley writes in her commentary on this performance, sees that, and I quote, "The real message of the performance was that external experiences dictate our supposedly free choices. Here," she claims, "the self is seen as a pawn that lives under the illusion of self-determination, but that is, in reality, powerless to do anything but react to a given set of circumstances and events." Torres' piece, from the earliest to the most recent, she says, are about human powerlessness. I read this piece somewhat differently, seeing it as an exploration of power more than powerlessness, with the Foucauldian understanding that where there is power, there is always also resistance. As Foucault describes the workings of power through discourse, he highlights the complex and unstable process whereby a discourse can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. Part of the resistance this piece embodies, I think, is found in the making evident the externalizing of the discursive, ideological conditioning that functions at its best in a silent and unrecognized manner. The almost like sleeping of the title evokes the notion that the artist's unconscious is being accessed, and its externalization through the visual and audio material of the performance can thus be seen in a way as an exorcism. But of course, what we are witnessing is a practice almost like sleeping. Even if the artist himself is asleep in the middle of the piece, the arrangement of the piece in the space of the gallery is a wholly conscious, a carefully crafted act, an act of defiance, even as it speaks of the fact that one's life has in fact been determined by so many forces beyond one's control. A willful act, even as it admits that free will may well be nothing but an illusion. The sentences projected on the wall can be seen as a manifestation of what Pierre Bourdieu has called the habitus, which has been described as the unwritten musical score according to which the actions of agents, each of whom believes she is improvising her own melody, are organized, so clearly evoking what he himself had in that tape. Bourdieu has explained that the most crucial aspect of habitus is that it naturalizes itself and the cultural rules, agendas, and values that make it possible through the subject's misrecognition of it as natural, experienced as just the way the world is, which in turn allows for the naturalization of domination. The habitus is like a skin we live in, which we don't even recognize we have, made up of assumptions and values, ideas and codes that delineate what we conceive of as possible and indeed real, just like all those sentences that he has on the wall. Bourdieu has expressed that all of my thinking started from this point. How can behavior be regulated without being the product of obedience to rules? This is no doubt also a question central to Torres' performance, as he grapples with the forces that have conditioned him, not necessarily by the imposition of explicit rules, although that too, no doubt, but by values and assumptions often transmitted through seemingly innocuous sentences. Bourdieu also highlighted that an important element of the habitus is that it, and I quote, revokes the common sense duality between the individual and the social by capturing the internalization of externality and the externalization of interiority. It seems to me that this dialectic is also at the heart of the performance, for Torres is externalizing the habitus in the various elements of his performance, a habitus which had previously been so very effectively internalized, as manifested by the anxiety and tension whose symptom are those painfully bitten nails. And what about those nails? I would like to stop for a minute and consider further the pain and anxiety whose symptom they are, the emotional force, the powerful affect that this symptom carries with it. The consideration of the emotional and affective dimension of the performance brings us back to something that works along the lines of an interior internalization of externality and externalization of interiority. Sarah Ahmed argues for a theory of affect and of the cultural politics of emotion, the title of her book, based on a model of what she calls the sociality of emotion, where, and I quote, emotions create the very effect of the surface and the boundaries that allow us to distinguish an inside and an outside in the first place. So emotions are not simply something I or we have. Rather, it is through emotions, or how we respond to objects and others, that surfaces and boundaries are made. The I and the we are shaped by, and even take the shape of, contact with others. Emotions create the very effect of an inside and an outside. Emotions here are understood, therefore, not as psychological states, but as social and cultural practices. So, the pain and anxiety that led to Torres' nail biting, emotions that are in turn communicated to us through the video in which he shows us that most visually accessible characteristic of his psyche, contribute to breaking down any barrier between the self and society, the internal and the external. The visualization and sharing of that symptom does also embody a cultural practice, a subversive one at that, for not only is it part of a practice of making visible the habitus, but it questions the very notion of an isolated, self-contained subject. In fact, by making public a most intimate aspect of his self, the video of his nail biting becomes a practice of what our critic, Giuliana Bruno, calls, in performance art, public intimacy, a practice that, working through the emotions, follows the feminist dictum that the private is public. Of course, the very fact that Torres is sleeping in the middle of the gallery floor while all the images hover around him is another essential element of this public intimacy that his performance is creating, and one more way in which a private practice erupts into a public space, dismantling the very distinction between public and private, and therefore throwing by the wayside the traditional notion of a gallery space that is supposed to showcase the work produced by an artist, not literally the artist himself sleeping there. But that was, of course, one of the agendas of performance art, no? The public intimacy that is created by the performance is one in which Torres, although asleep, is incredibly active. Far from being about powerlessness, therefore, I think that Torres' performance functions by juxtaposing the documentation of the forces that he has experienced as repressive with his own effort to resist them, even as he supposedly sleeps. It is the space of a performance through which the habitus that had conditioned Torres for so long is being made visible, spoken in a way, as we've said throughout the conference, and through that visibility is being resisted, contested, and critiqued. It is a space in which Torres is standing up, even while lying down, to the two towering figures, cultural conditioners, whose images look at him, and by extension at us, from a past that continues to affect the present. It is a space in which Torres is sharing in public, intimate, traumatic memories, and through that communication, working through his being possessed by them, thus resisting them. Not powerlessness, no, but power, and its unending resistance is what I believe Torres's performance is ultimately all about, and the creation of a subjectivity willfully working through the legacies of a traumatic past. Now, Torres's body, sleeping in the middle of the gallery space, is significant in yet another way in which the boundary between private and public is redefined. He is, after all, doing something typically done at home, but in a public space. We could say that his is a body not at home, an expression which, of course, evokes Frantz Fanon's notion of the body at home as a dynamic central to the workings of racism, which can be extended to other forms of domination. Sara Ahmed takes up Fanon's notion that society is always organized so that some bodies can feel at home, can easily act on their surroundings, be comfortable, because those surroundings are, in a sense, custom-made for them, within reach for them. Any form of domination, she explains, racism in the case of Fanon's analysis, orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they can take up space. Bodies that do not fit are disoriented. In Fanon's terms, they are not at home. To resist domination, therefore, one must seek a practice that begins with disorientation. Bodies that are not at home are stopped in a number of ways. They are questioned, they are marked, they are arrested, they do not pass easily in society. And being stopped, Ahmed explains, is not only stressful, but also makes the body itself the site of social stress. Terry was talking about the body being the site of a battlefield, no? One could see Torres's own body, asleep and not at home, in the middle of the gallery space, as a stopped body, one that is shown to be the site of social stress in the form of the habitus embodied by the other elements of the piece and the influence of those cultural conditioners under whose gaze he sleeps. This stopped, sleeping body becomes not just the site of social stress, but of a critical artistic practice too, a critical performance through which the forces that have made that body feel not at home are stopped or resisted themselves. Torres's body is not at home in multiple other ways, of course. In New York, he is literally not at home in terms of having left Spain. And it is precisely this distance from home, as he himself has said on numerous occasions, that allowed him to turn his critical gaze to his upbringing, his conditioning, and attempt to exercise their effect on him. The disorientation of being not at home, paradoxically, becomes what frees him to engage critically with his past. Another thinker who, decades earlier, had also had to leave his home and settle in New York to escape fascism in Europe, who also had to become a body not at home, I'm thinking of Theodor Adorno, had in works such as his Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life, explored the way that disorientation and discontinuity with one's original habitus could become not only the source of a pain and trauma that led to the damaged life of the title of his book, but also the point of departure for a critical practice of cultural critique and ethical reflection. As Adorno states, the value of thought is measured by its distance from the continuity of the familiar. Torres seeks this distance from the continuity of the familiar in this and other performances of the 1970s. And he too, like Adorno theorized, does it from the starting point of a damaged life, from the pain that the past continues to inflict on his body not at home in a gallery floor in New York in 1975, from the pain that manifests itself in that extreme close-up above his head of his raw, bitten nails. Adorno had also famously claimed that the splinter in your eye is the best magnifying glass, insinuating, I think, many things, but more directly related here, that it is both in the pain caused by that splinter as well as in the defamiliarizing effect that the splinter will necessarily have on vision, that a truly critical gaze will emerge, a gaze capable of undoing the harm of the various forms of political, cultural, social, and ideological domination and conditioning to which we are subjective. Only through confronting suffering, and only out of thinking from that suffering, will we learn to see in a manner capable of addressing the causes of that suffering. In Torres' performance, perhaps, the harrowing image of his bitten nails functions as a splinter in your eye. The splinter in his eye, the splinter in our eye, the sight of a pain, a wound, a trauma, of a damaged life, from which a critical reflection emerges, then as well as now, there as well as here. A critical reflection that, through its performance of trauma, asks, like Adorno did at the end of aesthetic theory, but then what would art be as the writing of history if it shook off the memory of accumulated suffering?